The roar of the crowd wasn't about the game. It wasn't about the players, the goals, or even the scoreboard. At Audi Field in Washington, D.C., thousands of voices rose together in unison, chanting words that shook the air and echoed across the city. Free D.C., free D.C. For a moment, the stadium didn't feel like a sports arena. It felt like a rallying ground, a place where ordinary people turned their frustration into thunder, sending a message that couldn't be ignored. And the target of that message? Donald Trump. The man who claimed he had Washington under his grip, only to be met with a wall of defiance he never expected. What made this night even more powerful was the timing. Trump had just returned from a trip abroad that left him bruised and exposed, his so-called strength crumbling under pressure. He walked back into the country weakened, and the people of D.C. seized the moment to remind him. Control isn't the same as respect. Authority doesn't erase resistance. This wasn't just a chant. It was a warning. And what unfolded inside that stadium is only the beginning of a bigger story, one that could shake Trump's hold on the nation's capital and maybe even the country itself. On that night in Washington, D.C., the energy inside Audi Field flipped from excitement to defiance in an instant. Fans who came expecting 90 minutes of soccer found themselves swept up in something much bigger. When the chant "Free D.C." first broke out, it started with just a handful of voices. But within seconds, it spread like fire. Whole sections of the stadium joined in, the rhythm growing louder and sharper until it felt like the entire building was shaking under the weight of the message. Trump had always claimed he held Washington in the palm of his hand, boasting about control and dominance as though the capital were his personal property. But here was the reality on full display. Thousands of everyday people united in open rejection. They weren't afraid. They weren't silent. They were daring him to hear them. Security inside the stadium looked unsettled. Cameras hesitated, unsure whether to pan away or capture what was happening. And for the first time, it was impossible to ignore the truth. The nation's capital was not quietly submitting to Trump's rule. Instead, the people were standing up in a way that couldn't be spun by political speeches or drowned out by social media posts. The most striking part? These weren't politicians or activists on a stage. These were families, workers, students, the heartbeat of D.C. itself, raising their voices in unison. The chant wasn't just noise. It was a declaration, a demand that echoed far beyond the walls of Audi Field. And if Trump thought he could brush it off as just another protest, he was about to find out that this was only the beginning, because the timing of this revolt tied directly to his return from a disastrous international meeting, and that connection would make the chant "Free D.C." even more explosive. Just hours before the chants of "Free D.C." thundered through Audi Field, Trump had landed back in the U.S. from a meeting that left allies furious and critics emboldened. In Alaska, of all places, he had rolled out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin. It wasn't a quiet handshake behind closed doors. It was a bold public spectacle that many saw as a direct insult to America's closest allies. European leaders had already been skeptical of Trump's erratic approach to diplomacy, but this time, the backlash was immediate and brutal. Reports claim that behind the scenes, heads of state confronted him, openly questioning why he seemed more eager to flatter Putin than to stand with NATO. Some even accused him of giving Moscow the upper hand in what should have been a show of Western unity. For Trump, who thrives on projecting strength, the optics couldn't have been worse. Instead of walking away as a deal-maker or power broker, he looked cornered, outmaneuvered, and weak. International headlines weren't about American leadership. They were about American submission. And the timing couldn't have been more devastating. While Trump was trying to spin the meeting as a success, Americans at home were already chanting for freedom from his grip. The contrast was striking. Abroad, he was treated as a man who had lost control of his alliances. At home, he was being mocked and rejected in his own capital. The image of strength he so carefully tried to build was unraveling in real time, and both the world and his own citizens were watching closely. And as the chants grew louder, another problem began to emerge, one that Trump couldn't simply dismiss as noise from a stadium. This wasn't just about optics anymore. It was about momentum. People across the country were starting to see Washington's defiance as a signal that they too could rise up. But before that wave of resistance could spread, Trump's team scrambled to do damage control, and their next move only made the cracks in his power even more visible. The morning after the Free DC chants echoed across social media, Trump's inner circle launched into overdrive. They knew the optics were brutal, a sitting president being publicly mocked in his own capital. So the strategy became simple: flood the airwaves with their version of the story before the narrative spiraled out of control. Trump's surrogates hit cable news with talking points ready-made. They insisted the chants were nothing more than paid agitators, claiming outside groups were staging protests to make the president look bad. Others tried to downplay the size of the crowd, suggesting that the viral clips circulating online had been edited to exaggerate the noise. And Trump himself, in his typical fashion, jumped on Truth Social to declare victory, saying that thousands of loyal supporters were in attendance and that the fake news media was trying to silence their voices. But here's the problem. The video evidence was undeniable. Fans from all walks of life, from families with children to longtime season ticket holders, had captured the chants on their phones. The hashtag #CharnFreeDC exploded across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Overnight, it wasn't just a chant in a soccer stadium. It became a movement online. Memes, remixes, and edits turned those three words into a rallying cry. And instead of killing the story, Trump's spin campaign did the exact opposite. His denial only made the moment feel bigger. Americans saw the raw, unfiltered footage with their own eyes, and then saw Trump insisting it didn't happen. The disconnect was glaring. To many, it was proof that the man who once branded himself as a straight talker had become just another politician desperate to cover up bad press. The chants spread from Washington, D.C. to stadiums in New York, Chicago, and even smaller cities across the Midwest. What started as a local protest quickly grew into a national symbol of defiance. For a president obsessed with crowd size and loyalty, it was the ultimate humiliation. The sound of his own people chanting for liberation from him. And as damaging as the chants were, they weren't the only problem brewing. Behind closed doors, even some Republicans were starting to whisper what had long been unthinkable: that Trump's grip on the party and on the country might finally be slipping. Inside Republican circles, the fallout from the Free DC chants hit like a shockwave. For years, GOP leaders had tolerated Trump's chaos because he delivered what they needed: votes, energy, and control. But this time felt different. This wasn't a Democratic protest or a media hit job. This was the heart of America's capital, openly revolting against him in front of cameras. And it was happening while the whole world was already mocking his humiliating meeting with Putin. Behind closed doors, some Republicans began asking questions they hadn't dared to raise before. If Trump is losing Washington, what's next? One strategist reportedly muttered. Another warned that the viral chants could easily become a midterm slogan for Democrats: short, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Even party stalwarts who had defended Trump at every turn were starting to sound nervous. Some feared the imagery of ordinary Americans chanting against him could chip away at suburban voters who were already drifting from the GOP. Others worried that sticking too closely to Trump meant sinking with him if his support finally cracked. And it wasn't just whispers. A few Republican lawmakers, cautiously but noticeably, began to put distance between themselves and Trump. They criticized his Alaska meeting as ill-timed or called the stadium chants concerning. It wasn't outright rebellion, but it was enough to suggest that the aura of fear Trump once commanded inside the party was beginning to fade. The most telling sign came from donors. Money talks in politics, and whispers spread quickly that several major contributors were quietly shifting funds toward candidates who branded themselves as Trump's policies without the drama. That phrase alone sent shockwaves through his inner circle. For Trump, losing loyalty was bad, but losing money, that was catastrophic. Yet even as cracks appeared in his own party, Trump doubled down. He wasn't about to show weakness, not publicly. Instead, he tried to turn the moment into yet another battle, portraying himself as the victim of betrayal from within. But while he raged, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. The chants of Free DC had pierced his armor, and the loyalty that once defined his party was no longer guaranteed. And if that wasn't enough, Trump's critics were about to deliver another devastating blow, one that would come not from chants in a stadium, but from the very halls of justice. As the Free DC chants gained traction nationwide, Trump faced another front he couldn't shout down: the courts. Investigations that had been simmering for months suddenly started boiling over, and the timing couldn't have been worse for him. In New York, prosecutors pushed forward with new filings in the hush money case, releasing evidence that directly tied Trump to payments once dismissed as old news. In Georgia, the election interference probe announced fresh subpoenas, dragging even more of Trump's inner circle into the legal spotlight. And in Washington itself, the very city chanting for freedom, federal investigators expanded their inquiries into classified documents and obstruction of justice. For Trump, it was a nightmare scenario. Every time he tried to change the conversation, another headline dropped. Every attempt to paint himself as the victim of a witch hunt was drowned out by detailed court filings, leaked testimony, and televised analysis that dissected his defenses piece by piece. The legal walls weren't just closing in. They were closing in at the same time the public was openly chanting against him. His lawyers scrambled to reassure him that these cases would drag out, that nothing would be resolved quickly. But the political damage was immediate. The chants of Free DC suddenly took on a double meaning, not just freeing the Capitol from Trump's grip, but also freeing America from a leader entangled in scandal after scandal. And the public saw it. For many Americans watching from the outside, the image was impossible to ignore. Trump wasn't the strongman he portrayed himself to be. He was cornered, mocked at home, weakened abroad, under investigation from every angle. The chants felt less like protest and more like prophecy, but perhaps the most dangerous part for Trump wasn't the prosecutors or the media. It was the shift in how ordinary people talked about him. At coffee shops, in classrooms, on TikTok, the question was no longer, is Trump in trouble? It was, how long before he finally breaks? And that question would only grow louder as the chants kept spreading, echoing far beyond Washington, D.C., into the very states Trump once considered safe territory. What started as a chant inside a single stadium in Washington didn't stay there for long. Within days, videos of Free DC flooded social media. TikTok edits spliced the chants with footage of protests, news clips, and even memes mocking Trump's fragile ego. Twitter threads spread like wildfire, and suddenly what looked like a one-off moment had become a rallying cry. At college campuses, student groups adopted the chant at rallies, painting it on banners and turning it into viral hashtags. Sports fans across the country began chanting Free DC during games, from basketball arenas in Los Angeles to baseball stadiums in New York. Each time it happened, the clips went viral, amplifying the movement far beyond politics. And it wasn't just young people. Older Americans who had grown frustrated with Trump's constant drama found themselves latching onto the phrase as a simple way to voice their exhaustion. Free DC became a slogan you could slap on a protest sign, a t-shirt, or a bumper sticker, and instantly everyone knew what you meant. Enough was enough. The most shocking part for Trump was watching his own former strongholds flip. In places like Ohio and Florida, where he once drew roaring crowds, protesters outside his rallies started chanting Free DC so loudly that reporters covering the events couldn't ignore it. Even conservative commentators who once defended him began quietly admitting that the phrase had struck a nerve. And the media frenzy only fueled it further. Every major outlet replayed the original chant, showing crowds in D.C. breaking into thunderous rhythm against Trump. News anchors openly wondered if this was the beginning of a political collapse, not just in Washington, but across the entire country. The echo was deafening, and Trump couldn't silence it. No matter how many all-caps rants he fired off online, the chant only grew louder, more defiant, more impossible to ignore. For a man who built his career on controlling the narrative, losing control so publicly was devastating. But this wasn't the peak. The chant was about to evolve, spreading from words to action. And what happened next would shake Trump's grip on power even harder. From one stadium chant to a nationwide movement, Free DC became more than just words. It turned into a symbol of resistance against Trump's iron grip. What started as a single night in Washington spread across the country like wildfire, shaking the foundations of his carefully built image. For the first time, the man who thrived on control was watching a narrative slip out of his hands. But here's the real question. Was this the first crack in Trump's armor, or just the beginning of something even bigger? Movements often start with a whisper, a spark, or a chant, and this one may have lit a fire that can't be put out. The louder the chant grows, the more it exposes the one thing Trump fears most, losing power not to politicians, but to the people themselves. So maybe the chant isn't just about freeing Washington, D.C. Maybe it's about freeing America from the grip of one man's ego. And if that's true, then this story isn't over, not by a long shot.